Okay. So we've been discussing different aspects of the relationship of Eshes Ach and of Yibum. That, of course, a very crucial topic. And so far, we've seen quite a few, issues that are dependent upon the question of whether or not this is a clashing relationship. In other words, it's a competition. There's a prohibition of Eshes Ach, and that would normally disqualify any relationship between um, the brother's wife and the brother-in-law, even after a get, for example, even after the passing away of the brother who was the husband, unless there are no children, in which case that's a yibum situation. In that circumstance, is a mitzvah of yibum, and the very fascinating question is whether or not this is a competition that is won by the overriding obligation of Yibum, but the downside, the problem of Eshes Ach remains a very much a factor. Or we take the position of Hutra. Hutra, of course, means that given the reality of the mitzvah of Yibum, namely that the brother died without leaving any kind of an heir, so the Isser Eshes Ach doesn't, apply under those conditions. And therefore, it's not that Yibum overrides it, it's that the circumstances of Yibum dictate that there is no clash, that there is no Isser Eshes Ach. So we've already discussed how this affects, for example, the Gemara on Daf Yud Amud Beis, the argument between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish, which is the following issue. Let's say there are multiple brothers and multiple co-wives. Back in the day, when it was possible for one man to marry more than one wife, Minat Torah. So let's say there were four brothers: Ruvain, Shimon, Levi, and Yehuda. We'll try to be original, And let's say there were four co-wives. Let's say Ruvain was married to Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, and Leah. Ruvain had four wives, and Ruvain has three brothers: Shimon, Levi, and Yehuda. So the point is that if Ruvain dies, so if Shimon does chalitza with Rivka, right? I'm sorry, if Shimon does chalitza with Sarah, just make it easier. So what happens going forward if, Levi, one of the other brothers, wants to have a relationship with Rachel or Leah, one of the other wives? So what we saw, that's a major debate between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. Reish Lakish is of the opinion that that would be a violation of Isser Eshes Ach, because even though the Yibum or Chalitza requirement has been satisfied, once it's been satisfied, as far as the other wives and brothers are concerned, everything reverts back to the principle of Eshes Ach. That is the perspective of Reish Lakish. We don't pass like Reish Lakish, but that's what he holds. Rabbi Yochanan says, no, it could have been that any of these brothers would have been either miyabim or choletz any of these wives, and therefore, when one of the brothers does chalitza or yibum with one of the wives, it's as if everybody, was represented in that action, and therefore the resolution of the requirement of zika and chalitza applies to all of the candidates, and therefore none of the candidates are subject to the principle of Eshes Ach. That is that's the view of Rabbi Yochanan. We paskin like Rabbi Yochanan, and what I tried to show last week is that there's a major debate. But even Rabbi Yochanan, I should add one other thing. Even though Rabbi Yochanan thinks that there's no violation of Eshes Ach, Rabbi Yochanan does think that having a relationship between any of the brothers and any of the other co-wives is prohibited, is asur. The only question is, what is the isur? So some say it's an isur of lo yivneh. Kivan shelo bana shuv lo yivneh. And others think it's a mitzaseh, and the Rambam thinks that if there was chalitza, it would only be what he calls, an isur midivrei sofrim, like shnios ba'arayos. We basically analyzed these shitas last time, but the takeaway is that while the Balei think that, even if there's no kares, that it's a dilution of isur eshasach, that's because they have the orientation of dechuya, because they look at Yibum as something which overrides Eshasach, but Eshasach is like an omnipresent reality. You never really banish it or get rid of it. It's always part of the landscape. The only thing is that Yibum overrides it, and the resolution of Yibum maybe moderates it, but it's still Eshasach. That's both the Bali Tosas hold. The Ramban, however, in his commentary to Sefer HaMitzvos, makes the point of counting a separate lav, number 14. He says that the Rambam omitted a whole bunch of lavin, and he counted, a whole bunch of things that shouldn't have been counted. So it has to even out according to the Ramban to 613, right? The Rambam holds that there were 613 mitzvos. So if the Ramban thinks that the Rambam counted, some things that he shouldn't have, then he has to, come up in his scheme with an equal amount of things that the Rambam should have counted but omitted, right? Otherwise, you don't get the balance of 613. So anyways, in that process, the Ramban suggests that the number 14 lav that was omitted by the Rambam is the prohibition to have a relationship between one of the other brothers and one of the other wives, or in certain circumstances, even the cholates, let's say, and the chalutza or the cholates and another wife, etc. But the Ramban makes the argument, unlike Tosas, who says it's the Isra Veshasach, but it's moderated on an Onesh level. The Ramban says no, it's an independent mitzvah. That's why we're counting it separately. It's not just a lighter Onesh, a lighter punishment. It has nothing to do with Eshasach. Why nothing to do with Eshasach? Because according to the Ramban, L'shitasa, this is what he writes in Torah Adam, this is what he writes in Sefer Mitzvos, this is what he writes in his Kiddushim on Batzach and Yevamos. According to the Ramban, the Isra of Eshasach is long gone. The second that, the husband died and didn't leave children, and there was a circumstance of Yibum, there's no Eshasach anymore. Even though you hasn't yet accomplished the Yibum or the Chalitza, Eshasach is just not applicable because it's two different circumstances, according to the Ramban, not a clash and a contest.
The Rambam says that once representing the Hutra group, that once you have Hutra, it's Hutra forever?
Yes, that seems to be the Ramban's view. That once you have Hutra, it's Hutra forever. And it's interesting because that's another Ramban. So the Gemara says
there wouldn't be the Lo Yivna pasuk, then everybody could go back and have relations with their sisters-in-law.
Well, they can't, but it's not an Isur Eshasach. It's an independent prohibition which says you
only
have the
opportunity. We have Lo Yivna.
Yeah.
But I'm saying, if not for that, once the Hutra situation existed, then it never comes back again.
The Isur Eshasach, correct, according to the Ramban. So, by the way, this is Ramban's view about something else as well. There's something called, I'm not going to go into this one, but I'm going to go into another one in a minute. But the Gemara on Lamed Omid Aleph, and then again on Mem Aleph Omid Aleph and Mem Daled Omid Aleph, the Gemara has has a principle called Nasra. Okay, actually, just look at it for a minute, you'll see what it is. The Mishnah on Lamed Omid Aleph has a very interesting take. Again, you have to get used to these cases so that they don't, they don't scare you. But this is the case. If you look on Lamed Amud Aleph in the Mishnah in the middle of the page, so it says Shlosha Achim. Everybody have that? Lamed Amud Aleph? Okay. Shlosha Achim. There are three brothers. Okay. Let's call them again. Reuven, Shimon, Levi. Shnai Mehem Nesuim Shnei Achios. Two of these brothers are married to two sisters. Two of the three brothers married sisters. Let's say let's say Reuven and Shimon married Rachel and Leah. Okay, and the third brother, the Echad Nasi Nachris, Levi, he married, Sarah, not a sister, just another woman. So what happens if Meis Echad Mibale Achios? Let's say one of the brothers who married the sisters, let's say Reuven, who was married to Rachel, right? Let's say he dies. The kines nasui nachris es ishto, and Levi, okay, is miyabem, Rachel. You have to understand, Shimon cannot be miyabem Rachel because he's married to Leah. So the fact that Leah and Rachel are sisters would exclude Rachel as a candidate for Shimon, but Levi, who's not married to one of the sisters, he could marry Rachel. So what happens if then, Mesa Ishtal Shalsheni, excuse me, and then let's say the other sister died, Leah died. Okay, one more time. It's a little complicated. Reuven, Shimon, and Levi are brothers. Reuven and Shimon are married to two sisters, Rachel and Leah, right? So Reuven dies. He leaves Rachel as a Zekuka Ligibum. She marries Levi because she can't marry Shimon because Shimon is married to her sister. So she marries Levi, right? And then Leah, who's married to Shimon, dies. So there's no longer another sister in the mix. And then, of course, V'achakach Meis Nasi Nachris. Then Levi dies. Okay? So when Levi dies, right, now Shimon is confronted with Leah, right, with Rachel, who originally was married to Reuven, then was married to Levi, was also originally his wife's, Leah's sister, but now Leah has died. And now the question is, can Shimon, when Levi dies, and Leah is now a candidate for Edom, at this point, there's no sister to be an obstacle.
Some would say she's a Katlonet at this point, no?
Right? So the question is, can he be miyabim her or not? So the Mishnah says, Harezu Asura Olav Olamis, Hol Venesra Olav Shachas. Once she is prohibited to him as a Yavama candidate at some point at the time in the beginning of the first Zika, so forever she is prohibited, even though the reason for her prohibition goes away. That's called the din of Nesra. And the Gemara explains it. Amar Rav Yudah Marav, Kol Yavama she'ena nikore ba b'shas nefila Yavama yavo aleha, harehi ke'esh asach sheyesh lo banim.
So once prohibited, always.
Just 1 second. Just one second. Just want to get this one line in, and then I'll take the question. What does it mean? Any circumstance where at the beginning of the Zika, the woman is disqualified for Yibum, we treat her as Esha Sachshi Esh Labanim, as someone who is not subject to Yibum, Viasura, and therefore she is off limits forever.
So this is the din.
This din is called Nasra. Nasra means that if a woman is off limits at the beginning of the Zika, then even if that changes, there are some exceptions, but even if that changes, it doesn't make a difference. Now, what was the question?
Once prohibited, always prohibited? Is that the
Once
idea?
Prohibited in a fundamental way, at least.
It's really the same concept as Hutra.
Oh, one second. However, the Gemara says,
but the same concept.
Well, but a Nesra, yeah. So, but on Mem Aleph, Amud Aleph, this is what I want to bring to your attention. Let's say the circumstances were a little bit different. Okay, let us say that at the time of the Zika, let's say Reuven, Shimon, and Levi again. let's say Ruvain was married to this woman, Rachel. Okay. And let's say that Shimon was married to Sarah. Okay. So at the time of and let's say Ruvain dies. So now Rachel is a candidate for Yibum, and there's no obstacle because Shimon's only married to Sarah. Sarah's not the sister of Rachel. However, let's say Shimon then goes ahead and marries Leah, separate from the Yibum. In other words, he wasn't married to Rachel's sister at the time of the beginning of the Zika, but he, at some point before he decided what to do, he separately married her sister. Okay? So now he cannot do Yibum with Rachel because he's now married to Leah, right? But let's say then she dies. Okay? It's a little complicated. So this is what happened. At the time of the Zika, Rachel was a candidate for Yibum. Then subsequently, she became excluded as a candidate for Yibum because the Yavam married her sister. But then that ended up getting neutralized by the death of the new wife of the sister. So if you want to know what it is, it's called Hutra, the Nasra, the Chazer Hutra. Originally, she was Muteres, this sister, because she wasn't a sister. Then she became, for a period, Asura, right? And then after that, she became Muteres again.
Oh, we have a rule: once prohibited, always prohibited.
So that's a machlokas in the Gemara. And what we paskin like is that if it's Nasra Mitchila, then she's Asura Olamis. If it's Hutra v'Nasra v'Hutra, then Chazra lehatera. You can see the difference. Why? So the Ramban, who believes in Hutra, says it's very simple. And the Rajba says it even more explicitly than the Rajba on Mem Aleph Amud Aleph. I'm sorry. The Rajba on Mem Dalid Amud Aleph and the Ramban on the other way. The Rajba on Mem Aleph Amud Aleph and the Ramban on Mem Dalid Amud Aleph explain it in the following way. They say, listen, if at the time of the Zika, the initiation of the Yibum, if she's Nasra, then there's no Hutra, because there was never a moment when there was a potential for Yibum. And therefore, there's no reason. It's just like, it's almost as if, there was a situation where the husband died and he left children, right? So in this case, he died, but the wife that he leaves behind is not subject to Yibum because the Yavam is married to her sister. So that's called Nasra, and that's the Isra of Eshesach, because there's no circumstance of Yibum. There's no potential of Yibum. And that is something, the Zika depends on the beginning of the process, and therefore, if it's Nasra, it's Nasra Olamis. There's no going back. However, if when the husband died, she was permitted to the Yavam, because at that time he wasn't married to her sister. So then there's never any Yisrei Shasach. The only thing is that if he then ends up, marrying her sister before he does Yibum or Chalitza, he cannot be miyabem her, not because of Yisrei Shasach, but because he's married to her sister. But then, if the sister dies, right, there's no problem of Eshesach because there never was an Eshesach. It's Hutra.
I'm having a problem with how this case ever gets off the ground. Forget about Yibum. If Ruvain has Kiddushin with Rachel, right, didn't do the second part, just Kiddushin, okay, and then he wants to marry the sister Leah.
No, not he. Shimon, the brother.
No, but we have a situation here right now where there was a Ziku.
Ruvain can never marry the sister.
No, But what I'm saying here is that
unless his wife dies,
once she's in a position of being a Yavama, she's like
right?
potentially engaged to the brothers. Okay,
And,
it's Mina Shemayim engagement, we said. Okay,
no, that's
basically.
called Zika. That's a debate in
Right.
the
So
Gemara.
Zika is like Kedushin in a regular marriage.
No, so that's a
Just
debate in
like
the Gemara whether
just like
Zika
in Kedushin,
Daraisa.
one
That's a
cannot
debate in
be,
the Gemara.
huh? Excuse
That's a
me.
debate in the Gemara whether Zika Daraisa or Zika Darabanan.
Let's assume, according to those that say Zika is the Raisa and is
Either way, it's not Eishasish. It's prohibited, but it's not Eishasish. That's why there's no kares. And that's a debate in the Gemara in a bunch of places in the Masechta, whether
somebody
it's
could
Zika
make
Daraisa or
Kedushin
Zika
with the
Darabanan.
sister and then marry the other sister, and it's okay.
Say again?
So somebody can make Kedushin with one of the sisters and then marry the other sister, and it's okay.
I'm not sure what you mean by that.
Ruvain has
A little more.
Kedushin, but doesn't have what's it called again with Rachel, and then he decides to marry Leah. Can he do that?
Outside of Yibum?
Yeah,
No, of
a
course not.
guy. So why is Yibum different? One says a Zika.
Because Zika is
Zika is
not.
like Kedushin, we said.
No, it's not. It's less than Kiddushin. That's why there is
Some
even.
say it's stronger than Kedushin because it's Min HaShamayim. It's
No. Tikla min Shemayim, and therefore, even without its separate act of Erusin, you may have the equivalent vis-a-vis the Yavam, but it's a Shomeres Yavam, meaning a woman in a state of Zika is prohibited from outside relationships. However, the punishment is much less severe than an Ashes Ish. Because
no,
in the end,
but how could the brother forget about the punishment? How could the brother marry?
you want to know how Shimon, the brother, could marry Leah if he's in a state of Zika with.
Exactly.
So
Why is it not
that
equivalent
is
to Kedushin?
right. I'm just telling you that is the machlokas in the Gemara about whether we call it.
But this Mishnah assumes that he can do it.
No, there's
The
an
argument of this
argument whether
Mishnah is that he can do it.
everybody agrees that it's not a good thing. And there's a debate whether if he were to go ahead and to marry her, whether or not that would be permissible or not. But that's not even the case that we're talking about, because the case that we're talking about is a case where, let's say, one of the other brothers took care of the Zika, and then he married the sister. So it's even if you hold Zika Daraisa, right? Let's say
so the marriage occurred after the Zika.
I'm saying you could easily have that case too. If the marriage takes place during the Zika, that's called achos zikukaso, and that's a debate in the Gemara whether you say Zika Daraisa or not. Is Zika kinesua or not? That's the discussion. There are quite a few sugyas in the Gemara that discuss that question. And that's an argument. And there's an argument how you paskin. But the idea that Shimon could be married to Rachel's sister is something that can happen in a different way, and that is if Levi, right, is either miyabem or choletz Rachel. Let's say he's miyabem Rachel, right? So then it's totally permissible for Shimon after that to marry Leah, and then if Levi dies, then there are two sisters who are, but who he's married to one sister and the other sister is in the state of Zika to him, but it's after the legitimate marriage. So there are circumstances in which that would be totally acceptable. All right. Anyways, the bigger idea I wanted to explain, just to come back to it for a minute, is that there's a debate in the Gemara whether we distinguish between what's called Nasra, that's the case I mentioned on Lamed Amud Aleph, means that at the moment of the Zika, you have two sisters married to two brothers. Brother number one dies. At the moment of that Zika, since brother number two is married to brother number one's wife's sister, that's called Nasra. And even if his own wife dies subsequently, and that would seem to solve the problem, Nasra is a permanent situation, and it's asur. However, there's a view in the Gemara, which is how we paskin, and that is if it's hutra v'nesra v'hutra, then it's hutra. Then it's chazra latera rishon. And that is the circumstance where, let's say, originally there was no, in the beginning of the Zika, there was no achos ishto. He wasn't, Shimon was not married to Rachel's sister. And then later on, let's assume if you hold that view of Zika, he went ahead and he married her. So now he that's called Hutra v'it Nasra, because now he cannot be miyabem, Rachel, because he's married to Leah. But then if Leah dies, that's called Hutra Nasra v'Hutra, and the rule would be that it's Chazra Latera Arishon, and he would be allowed to, he would be permissible for him to be miyabem Leah.
And those who hold
the explanation for the explanation for that, according to the Rajba and the Ramban, is once again the principle of Hutra, namely, since originally there was a mitzvah of Yibum, even though it wasn't implemented fast enough until there ended up being an impediment because he married the sister, and therefore it's two sisters. But nonetheless, the fact that we banished the Isur of Eshesach through Hutra from the very beginning means that the only obstacle is a temporary obstacle. And when a temporary obstacle is removed, then you return to the pre-obstacle state, namely there's no Eshesach and there would be Ibum. But if you hold like the Balei Tosas, it's really different.
They would disagree? What? The Balei Tosas would disagree?
They don't disagree with the halacha, but they have a much more difficult time explaining.
Yeah, but if they hold the chuya, how can they agree with that?
Right. So they have to say things about Nasra that are a little bit different that I'm not going to get into right now. But that's what it is. Okay, so these are very important. Abashal, we said, may depend on Hutra Dechuya. We spoke about Uberes. Uberes is the case of, a situation where the woman, is pregnant when the husband dies, and basically what the Mishnah says in the beginning of the fourth parak is that if the child does not survive, I mean the pregnancy goes, it's tragically is not able to produce a healthy child, so then there is a zika. Limafreya, I mean, there's a zika from the time of the, original husband's death. However, there's an argument between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish whether a chalitza or a yibum that was done at the moment of her pregnancy, even if it turned out that she was omedes liyibum, whether or not that counts or not. And that's what the argument, another argument between Balei Tosas and the Ramban, because Tosas says, I don't understand if we take the view of Reish Lakish, which is that when she's pregnant, a chalitza or a yibum doesn't help, even if it turns out in retrospect that she was subject to yibum, then, even if it turns out that there is yibum because the child doesn't survive, why wouldn't this be a violation of Eshesach, and why wouldn't you have to bring a korban? So the Ramban actually does quote, this is what we saw last week, he quotes a view that says that it's true. Yeah, she should have to bring a korban according to Reish Lakish under those conditions.
I forgot we may have discussed it last week. Does it make a difference if he knew or she knew that they were pregnant?
Oh no, because it's a korban chatas. No, it's not amazing, but it's a korban chatas. It's an objective question. But the Ramban
is Yibum supposed to wait the 3 months?
Yeah, that's the chatchila midrabanan. That's called.
If not, if let's say she was 2-3 weeks pregnant, no, impossible to tell. Okay, so he's supposed to do yibum achalitza right away. I mean, according to the best approach to the. So the poor guy did what he was supposed to do. And there was no. Now it's another thing when he knew she was pregnant, then he didn't care, or she didn't care.
Yeah, no, there can be situations where people are just, no one's trying to do anything wrong.
No, because that's more like an ones. It's not even a shogeg, a chatas.
Yeah, but okay, but the point is that it's not It's not the absence of a violation; it may be the absence of an onesh. Anyways, but the Ramban's solution to this problem is very simple. Ramban says there's no korban because if it turns out that there's yibum, then it turns out there never was eshesach because it's hutra, and even far before, even though you can't do the yibum and the chalitza until the pregnancy is over, nonetheless, already from the time that the husband died, it turns out that there was no eshesach. So these are very concrete cases where hutra and dekuya really matter, and that's why it's a leitmotif.
But even the hutra is a machlokus whether it starts at the time of death or it starts at the time when he does either the yibum or chalitza. No.
Say that again.
Even by hutra, isn't there a machlokus as to whether it starts at the time of?
I'm just saying, if you say it starts earlier, then it has to be hutra because there's no clash at that point. If it starts later, it could still be hutra, but it could be.
But then the Ramban's answer doesn't.
No, the Ramban is of the opinion that it's an early hutra. The Ramban in Torah Adam and the Ramban in Sefer Mitzvos and the Ramban in Andaf Mem Dalid Amud Aleph and all the places the Ramban speaks about hutra from the moment that it turns out that she is obligated to yibum, which means at the moment of the Misa Sabal, not at the moment that the mitzvah is actually accomplished. But for Tosas, it's a dechuya, so it's always a problem, because that time period in between, or, as long as you're not fulfilling the mitzvah, there should be this sort of Damocles, of yibum, I'm sorry, Veshasach. Okay, so one other Gemara that I wanted to look at, which is a really interesting Gemara anyway, and that is the Gemara Nun Daled Amud Beis, and I want to look at Tosas and the Ramban there too.
Nun Daled Amud Beis.
Nun Daled Amud Beis. I have the Gemara's in the Mar Makomos, but it's better to see it always in the Gemara itself. Okay, so this is Nun Daled Amud Beis. Okay, so the background, it starts from Be'ela Nida Diksiva Gabe Eshasach Lamali. Everybody have that?
We're in the
page 54b.
Yeah, but we're in the page.
It is, I'll tell you what it is. In my Gemara, it is 3, 6. It's like 9 lines down from the top of the page. All right? And the Gemara says, Ve'ela nida deksiva gabi eshasach lamali.
Yeah, right.
Okay, so just a little bit of background. This is the pasuk in not Nachrei Mos, but in Parshas Kedoshim, Perek Chaf, pasuk second, Perek Chaf pasuk Chaf Aleph in Vayikra. So the pasuk reads as follows: there are 2 parshios of arayos in the Torah. One is in Parshas Nachrei Mos. That's the main one, where the Torah delineates all the various arayos. And then there's another one, in a smaller one in Parshas Kedoshim. The order is a little different. It's very interesting, actually. Why there are 2 parshios, but okay. Anyways, in Parshas Kedoshim, Perek Chaf, Pasuk Chaf Aleph, the Torah says the following: B'ish asher yikach es eshes achiv. If a man, tries to have a relationship with his wife, his brother's wife, that's what we're talking about, eshes ach, right? So v'ish asher yikach es eshes achiv. But listen to the language of the Torah. The Torah says nida he. She is a nida. Ervas achiv gila, since he has exposed the erva of his brother, aririm yiyu. Aririm is a reference to a kind of kares, we'll call it. I mean, they deserve a severe punishment for this illicit, relationship. So what bothered the Gemara, which would bother anybody, which you read the Psukim, why does the Gemara, which is talking about Eshes Ach, call an Eshes Ach a Nida? You know what Nida is. Nida is a woman who is Roa Dam, Minamakar, right? She has a menstrual flow, and that's, a very important pillar or foundation of, Taharas HaMishpacha and Tumah V'Tahara generally. We know what a nida is. A nida is not a sister-in-law. I mean, a sister-in-law could be a nida, but
actually, the opposite, because it's within a permitted relationship, and it's a temporary.
yeah, which we'll discuss. By the way, we'll discuss that in terms of Yibum too. That's Tosas and a rare beginning of the Masechta, which we're a little bit out of order, so we'll go back to that. So that's an important question, but not for now. But this pasuk, Isha Sher Yikachas Eishes Achiv Nidahi. What do you mean Nidahi? If a man tries to marry or to have a physical relationship with his brother's wife, Nidahi, she's considered off limits. But the way the Gemara calls it,
it would almost seem that she's
by saying Nidahi.
Only temporarily off limits.
Oh, 1 second. Excellent. And then the Gemara says, then the pasuk says, Ervas Achiv Gila, since he has exposed the nakedness, the shame of his brother, right? Ari Rim Yiyu. Both of them who committed this crime, namely the brother-in-law and the sister-in-law, are punished, severely. So this is what the Gemara says. Now go back to the Gemara. So the Gemara says, Ella, Viella. Everybody have it? This is 3, 6, 9 lines.
Next to the Tosus Amru.
Yeah. The Ella Nida Deksiva Gabi Eshasach, when the Torah uses the expression to describe the prohibition of Eshasach and it calls her a Nida, Lamali, like why does it use that expression? That's just strange. Obviously, what it means by it is that she, is prohibited. But why? But we also, that's not what we normally associate the word Nida to mean, right? So listen to exactly what you said. The Gemara says, Likad Rav Huna. It's based on an insight of Rav Huna. The Amar Rav Huna remez li yivama min haTorah minayin. Listen to this. Rav Huna said, what's the hint of Yibum min haTorah? So the Gemara says, minayin. What are you talking? What do you mean
I mean, hint. It's
explicit psuk, right? The Gemara says, minayin haksiv. It's an explicit pasuk in Kitetse. Yavama, Yavo, Aleha. Right? Those are the psukim we began our discussion in the beginning of the year. The psukim in Parshas Kitetse. What do you mean a remez, a hint? It's not. You don't need a hint. You have an explicit statement about Yibam. Says the Gemara. Listen to this. Ela remez liyavama sha'asura b'chai bala minay. How do you know that a sister-in-law, meaning the wife of a brother, how do you know that she is prohibited to the brother-in-law while the brother is alive? Says the Gemara, what are you talking about? I svarahi. It's obvious that she is prohibited to the brother when the brother is alive, when the husband, meaning the husband brother, again, Ruvain and Shimon, right? So Ruvain's married to Sarah. So the Gemara is saying, how do you know that Sarah is prohibited to Shimon, the brother, when Ruvain is still alive? So the Gemara says, what are you talking about? Haisfar, that's obvious. Mid Amar Achman al-Achar Misas Bala Shari, the only heter of Yibum is when Ruvain is no longer with us. He died. So then, if there are no children, then Shimon will be permitted to have a relationship, will be obligated to have a relationship, with Sarah. But obviously, if Reuven is still alive, even if there's a divorce, of course, they're talking about a divorce. Even after a divorce, there can't be a relationship between Shimon and Sarah. Even after Reuven divorces Sarah, Bechlal the B'chaye Bala, even after a divorce, Asura. And what the Gemara is speaking about implicitly.
Bala means after a divorce.
Yeah. Well, otherwise, he's an Eshes Ish, right? And obviously, what they're talking about is in a situation where there are no children. Meaning, what the Gemara is playing with is the possibility that if there are no children in the marriage, even after a divorce while the husband is alive, maybe we don't apply the full force of the Isser Eshesach. So the Gemara says, Vidilma, how do you know? Not such a crazy idea. The Dilma says, this is just a remarkable Gemara. The Dilma, la'achar misas bala mitzvah. the chaye bala rishus. Maybe the chiddush when the Torah says that there's something that there's a mitzvah only after he dies and doesn't leave any children. That's for the mitzvah. That's for the chiyuv. But maybe it's permissible already for Shimon to have a relationship with Sarah, as long as Ruvain and Sarah had no children, even if he's still alive, but they're just divorced. Maybe that would be a permissible relationship. It just wouldn't be an obligatory relationship. Wow. That's very shocking, right?
Not so shocking, because you can marry a sister of another. We have it when two sisters, so it's
only after that's the closest that we have.
Yeah,
but even that is only after one sister dies, not after a divorce.
right, correct.
But you're right. At least in most cases, like if you're talking about, a stepmother, so that's even after everybody, after divorce, after death, doesn't make a difference. Achos ishto, the other sister-in-law, as I like to call her, meaning the sister of your wife, that does have a heter, like you just said, but that's only after misas, ishto. In other words, he can marry Rachel, even though he's married to Leah, if Leah dies, but not if he and Leah get divorced. But the Gemara's Havamina was, if there are no children, then Shimon could marry Sarah if she had no children and there's a divorce with Ruvain. Wow.
Where would the
Says
Hakim, where would the Hakim Shem Achiv come after a divorce? I mean,
well, the Hakim Shem Achiv is a mitzvah, and that's only when he dies.
yeah, but how would you compare it to when there's a divorce? I mean, it doesn't make any sense.
No. But if there's a divorce, so then there's a heter, but there's no mitzvah. It's not Hakim Shem Lachiv, and that would be crazy, right?
Right.
They're divorced, but it would be a heter. So then uinami, the Gemara says, la'achar misas bala, right, in b'chai bala lo. The lava b'mechlal I'll say, or maybe the idea is that there would be a prohibition for Sarah and Shimon to have a relationship as long as Reuven was alive, even after a divorce. But instead of being chayve krisus, maybe it would be only a violation of an asay. I mean, it would be a lot less. Yeah. So therefore, the Torah says, listen to this. Amar Kra, therefore the Torah says, Isha sher yikachas eshes achiv nidahi, v'chi eshes achiv nidahi. What does it mean when the Torah uses the expression nida when it's talking about eshes achiv, the wife of his brother? The answer is Ella, exactly what you said before, kin nida. What the Gemara meant to say is it's just like nida, meaning ma nida afal pi sheyesh laheter la'achar mikan. Even though in the case of Nida, right now she's Asura, but we know she'll be Muteres. Nonetheless, Bishasi Surah Bekares. But while she's Asura, the fact that she will in the future not be is irrelevant. We treat her as she is right now. Af Eshes Ach Nami. The same is also true about a sister-in-law, meaning the wife of a brother. Mikan, even though if there are no children and Ruvain dies, Shimon will be not only permitted, but a mitzvah to marry her. And you might have thought that that would also echo or resonate in being more makil, either permitting or lowering the onesh level after a divorce, even b'chayav, right? B'chay bala b'kares, right? I'm sorry, b'shasi sur b'kares, af eshasach nami, af b'sheyesh heter la'achar mikan, right? B'chaye bala b'kares. Therefore, the Torah is telling us, just like a nida, even though, in the future there's a heter, even though there's a heter waiting to happen, right? Nonetheless, while she's asura b'kares, so too eshasach, even though with she'ein labanim, even though in the future there's a potential mitzvah, Nonetheless, until you reach that point, it is a typical, routine, severe ashes.
I mean, it's not a perfect example because by Nida, there's a before and after, and by this is only an after.
That's true. That's true. Right. But the Gemara should be that.
The point is still made, yeah.
Yeah. So this is a really fascinating question. Like, what kind of strange Gemara is this? It's almost the opposite. It's almost like a different kind of a hutra. They're saying, oh, since, in the future, since in theory there could have been, a heter based on Yibum, so therefore that reflects that even in the state of Isser, it's a different kind of an Isser. So what I want to show you is two things. The Ramban and Tosas read this Gemara or understand this Gemara in two opposite ways. Both of them have trouble with it. It's a strange Gemara. This Gemara is like turning again, not the let me make it clear, not the maskana. The conclusion of the Gemara is that everything is back to where it was. There's a mitzvah of yibum for an eshesach when the husband dies and leaves no children. But as long as he is alive, even after a divorce, even without children, there's a complete Isser of eshesach. That's the maskana, and that's fine. The question is, you needed a pasuk, you need the Torah to call Eshes Ach Anida in order to know that, because the thought was that maybe the fact that there is, a potential of Yibum when there are no children, maybe that indicates, that Eshes Ach is a more makil, erva, right? Even while the brother is alive and there is no mitzvah sibo.
Because of the word nida?
No, the word nida teaches you it's not true, but otherwise you might have thought that. You might have thought that since there's an exception to Eshes Ach, even though it's a very focused exception, that exception, is relevant even to full-blown Eshes Ach, or at least almost full-blown Eshes Ach. So this is what Tosas says about this. Look at Tosas on the top of the page, or in the Maramakomo sheets, either way. It says the following. Everybody have that? The top Tosas, or it's in Maramakomos, it should be, here, let me give it to you. It should be on page... page 4. You have Talmud Bavli Yevamos Nun Daled Omid Beis. That's the Gemara we just read. And then you have Tosfos Nun Daled Omid Beis, followed by Chidushei Haramban Nun Daled Omid Beis. Everybody have that?
Yes.
The Kivin the Shori.
Okay. So Tosas says the following. Listen to the Tosas.
El Remez.
It's also the top one, on the page if you have the actual physical page. El Remez Li Yevamos Asur B'chai Bala Minai. So Tosa says, the Kivan Deshari Rachmana Acharmisa, since the Torah permits a relationship between Shimon and Sarah, meaning between this brother and sister-in-law, this brother and his brother's wife, in a circumstance of Yibum, Lacharmisa, Ein Svar Lomar Das Sira B'chai Bala. Maybe it's not so obvious that this prohibition is applicable or fully severe even after a divorce while he's still alive. The lo mistaber, at this point, the Gemara thought it wasn't logical to think sheyabah kosav lomar da'aseh aseh v'dacha los aseh sheyesh bo kares ilav demuchach kra behedja. Unless the Torah teaches us, which it ends up teaching us by calling it a nida, we would not have been comfortable with the idea that the only heter is based on ase docha los ase sheyesh bo kares, meaning the mitzvah of yibum overriding eshesach. What is that? The answer is that's Tosas Lishitaso. the Bali Tosfos from beginning to end keep thinking that what is Yibum?
The
Dekuya. And it's really an example. That's how Tosa started on Gimel Amid Beis. It's really an example, an exception to the rule of Ase Docha Los Ase Sheyesh Bakares as a Dekuya. So Tosa says, we wouldn't have known this principle that Yibum is Doche Isarei Shasach, and therefore it's limited to La'achar Misa Kishe'en Lo Banim. We wouldn't have known that if the Torah didn't tell us, because it's very mechudash to think that the mitzvah of Yibum overrides, even though it's overrides even an Isar Kares. So what would we have thought? There are two questions now. What would we have thought? And now what do we think once we have the pasuk? So what we would have thought apparently is the following fascinating idea. And that is, if there are no children in a marriage and there's a divorce, so then the connection of the past to the husband, right, is more tenuous. And that might allow for a heter, or at least a moderated onesh, not the regular hsach. Meaning having children, according to this, perspective, in a marriage is about the intensity of the marriage and its capacity to continue to define relationships even after the marriage is over, in terms of a get. But if there are no children and there's a divorce, the thinking would be that, maybe, like you said, like Achos Isha, but even less in a way. That was a Havamina. But which is fascinating.
Does this get to the question of whether
in Lemaskana, the children play a role because the Mechayiv is Lahakim La'achid Shem Israel. But in the what the Gemara thought, if not for the word Nida, what we would have thought is that the role of the children isn't about Lahakim La'achiv Shem, it's about the persistence of a bond between husband and wife, even after a get that precludes a relationship with the brother.
When there's no children.
When there's no children.
Would this get to the machlokus of whether Kedushin is the mitzvah or Peru is the mitzvah?
Maybe, but you can get separate from that. But I think it's relevant to bring up for sure. I mean, your point is well taken. But I think this is a really fascinating idea. Again, we don't accept it, la halacha, but the Torah says, the way the Gemara goes, according to Tosas, is, if it not for the word nida, we would have thought that that eshes achiv la'achar gerushin b'li banim, is
not an obligation, but a possibility.
Yeah. But what is the kamash malan? We do have the word nida, so that isn't true. So what is, excuse me? Excuse me. Okay. What is the kamash malan? It's what we wouldn't have known if not for the pasuk. And Tosas tells us what it is. The asi ase v'dachalos ase sheyesh bakares. Wow, that Tosas is telling us, how does Yibum work? The chuya. It's an exception to the rule that ein ase dochalos ase sheyesh.
But it's not Nida that tells us that; it's the explicit pasuk that tells us that.
Fine. The comparison in the pasuk, the word nida in Parshas Kedoshim teaches us that the mitzvah of Yibum in Parshas Kitetse is based on the principle of ase dochalos ase sheyesh bakares, namely the chuya. However, is any of this going to be appealing to the Ramban? Unlikely, because according to the Ramban, it's just not true that Yibum works midin dechuya, that it works midin ase dochalos ase apapi sheyesh l'kares. How does the Ramban understand Yibum? That in the circumstance of ein lo banim and mace, there's no way, shasach. Right? Hutra. So the Ramban has a much, much more difficult time, consuming this Gemara. What does he say about it? So the Ramban says, if you look in the Mar Makomos here, Says the Ramban, koshali. Ramban says, I have a problem. Right? La'achar misas bala deshari mitzvah hashar kol nashim gedekaimon kaimon. The Ramban doesn't consider the possibility that having children or not having children is something that figures into the intensity, therefore the continuity of the relationship, even after a get. That doesn't make sense to him. Because for the Ramban, Yibum is not problematic. It's not dechuya. Yibum is a mitzvah in which there's no Isur Eishasach. But without Yibum, there's totally Eishasach. There's a certain irony, meaning even though Ramban holds Hutra, he only holds Hutra because of Yibum, because of the mitzvah of Lahakim La'akiv Shem. But if it wasn't, it's so overriding that mitzvah that it's not just dechuya, it's a totally different circumstance that is Hutra, that negates the Isur Eishasach. But anything less than that mitzvah, for example, if we were talking about a divorce and the husband was still alive, right, you'd have to say Isur Eishasach legamri. So the Ramban has a much more difficult.
It's not so far-fetched for the Ramban
the Gemara.
Same concept that, okay, it's an obligation, the Hutra, it's not just Hutra, it's an obligation to do
the obligation is what makes it Hutra. But if there's no obligation because there's a divorce.
He could take up the position, especially since he holds this from the point of death, that it's the separation of the husband from the wife, okay, that creates the Hutra. And if he separates by dying or he separates by divorcing,
because
he leaves the marriage with no children.
And not if you think,
except in the case of death, it's just like Tosus says, it's an obligation.
But it's not if you think that Yibum is the circumstance that excludes Eishasach.
Well, remember, the Ramban holds that it starts from the point of death.
It does, but only because there's a mitzvah of Yibum, because the Hakim La'achiv Shem B'Yisrael. But if he's alive and well, there's no mitzvah Hakim La'achiv Shem. He's out there.
But that point is a difficulty for Tosus also.
No, not at all.
I mean, the guy's alive right now. I mean, that logic that the Hakim Shem doesn't
right. But Tosus doesn't care. Tosus doesn't think that Tosus doesn't need Yibum, right, to for Hutra. Tosus thinks that if Yibum works, it would be Dechuya, and we only know that because of this pasuk. That's why I'm saying, according to Tosus, the Gemara's possibility that divorce would also be a factor has to do with the objective nature of the relationship when there are no children in a marriage and there's a divorce. Then it's easier to just walk away and say there are no permanent, impact, or at least it's diluted. But for the Ramban, who thinks that the only reason that Yibum, creates Hutra is because of the mitzvah of Yibum, that doesn't apply at all as long as he's alive. So the Ramban had to come up with something that creates a kind of Hutra because of the potential of Yibum, not like the Balei Tosus, but because of the potential of Yibum, that also could create a Hutra. And that's what he suggests. So look what he says. The ilo tema, first of all, part of his question. The ilo tema hachi ala islandis, the Eishas Hachiv Shaloyo Bola Monami the Sharian, Afagav the Patrin Rachmana Yibum. The whole reason that Yibum is Hutra is because of the potential of Lahakim La'akiv Shem B'Yisrael. Not because what you said a second ago, which was that there's a death and there's no children per se. Because then why wouldn't an Ilanus, who doesn't have the ability to give birth, or an Achiv Shelo Haya B'Olamo, let's say, a little brother was born to the mace after he died, meaning his father had another child after he died. That's called Achiv Shelo Haya B'Olamo, right? So why is that excluded from Yibum? The answer is it's only the mitzvah of Yibum, not the fact of Meis Below Banim, that is responsible for the Hutra. The Ikalamemar, so what's the answer? Very fascinating. Ikalamemar, when the Torah said that an Eshasach she'en labanim after misas bala, the mitzvah, gali she'en b'chal iser ela Eshasach b'makom deleka, what one's saying is that the iser of Eshasach itself is limited. The lake tzad, it's limited to any case where there is a tzad yibum, or where there was a potential of yibum even during the lifetime. Dahainu yesh labanim b'chaye bala. Aval ein labanim afilu b'chaye bala. Right? Kivan she'ilu amda etzlo sofa lehisyabim bitchila. Lochal shem eshes ach klal. Ramban says, if not for the pasuk, what we would have thought was, as long as there in this marriage is a potential yibum, there's not going to be an iser eshes ach, or full iser eshes ach.
I mean,
because if he were to die, right? I mean, again, as long as he's married to her, she's an eshes ish.
Yeah. So what does that mean?
It means that from the perspective of Eshes Ach, the Ramban says, you might have thought that you don't violate Eshes Ach, maybe you violate Eshes Ish. You never violate Eshes Ach, if not for this pasuk of Nida. You would have thought you never violate Eshes Ach as long as there is a potential down the road of Yibum. Meaning, as long as there are no children, since if he were to die at any point, there would be Yibum, there's no Eshes Ach.
Otherwise, you would think he gets two Isurim, Eshes Ach and Eshes Ish when he does something like that?
Yeah. So again, what emerges from the Ramban, this is the point I want to make. I know it's a little complicated, so I would apologize for the complexity, but it's not my fault.
We're missing a chalkboard.
It's Masechet, right? It's Masechet Yevama, so we're doing the best we can. I think it is very fascinating, but it is, the cases are a little complicated here and there, but they make a point. Imagine all the Chachamim who were manipulating these cases. They had to have, tremendous. Well, we know they did anyway. They don't need, to prove it from here, but they had just tremendous intellectual control and mastery, and they knew also how to, how to manipulate these cases to isolate, factors and components, like good, legal analysts and philosophers. Like they knew how to construct cases, that would isolate, and differentiate, in a very subtle way between, different, factors and principles. So what the Ramban is basically saying,
these cases that they had to decide on. In other words, did they hypothesize them, or did they actually have the cases that forced them to decide?
That's a great question, and I think the answer is yesh v'yesh. I mean, of course, there were actual cases, and they come up, and we have in the literature of Shelos Chuvos, we can actually see cases that came up. And in life, as you know, life is sometimes even stranger than fiction, right? So, the craziest things can happen, do happen. So for sure, a lot of it is pragmatic. But we also, and in some of the cases in the Gemara cases that came, to the Chachamim, but it's also clear that, in discussions of the principles of law, both in the Gemara and in the Rishonim and so on, that some of the cases are explorations of the legal concepts, and that some of the cases are inventive cases in order to kind of, as I say, highlight or accentuate, isolate, usually these two things or three things come together, and therefore it's hard for us to know which of the three, is the dominant or the one that plays the role or what this is. And if we can, if we're good legal, thinkers, and we can isolate them, then we can identify, what the relationships really are. That's a lot of what's going on here. But there are for sure also real cases because Yibum was a real, institution, and life, is sometimes stranger than fiction. So, very complex, strange cases can happen. And you see it, all throughout rabbinic literature, especially responsa literature, but also in the Gemara, some of the cases are for sure very real.
Talking about
Anyways, just to sum up,
if I may, there's one that I'm thinking in my mind. We know that while the older brother has the mitzvah of Yibum or Chalitza, another brother could jump in, so to speak, and do it. What happens if two of them do it exactly the same time?
Well, we usually say Yefshal at some time, but
I understand. I was thinking about that also, but putting that aside.
It actually comes up in another context, which we'll explore. But you would treat it probably as a suffix because you wouldn't know. But if they did it, because they can't. I mean, legally they can't.
No, but once one does it, no one else can do it. But I'm saying, what if two of them do it at the same time?
Right. So you wouldn't know. You would assume that they, that you just don't know, which one did it first. Unless they say after the same, then it would be like a more of an intrinsic suffix. But we will have that in another case. There's something called, this will stop for today, but there's something called Eshes Shnei HaMesim, the Zika of Eshes Shnei HaMesim. What's the case? Or a few cases. So one case is, let's say Ruvain marries Sarah. Okay. But what he does, he marries her in such a way, this is like a legal issue, but according to one view in the Gemara in Gittin, he says, so Hareyat Mukadeshli Chutz Me Shimon. Like I'm marrying you vis-a-vis the rest of the world, but not vis-a-vis my brother Shimon. And then Shimon comes along and marries her. So on some level, she can't live with either of them, but she needs a divorce from both of them. So the Gemara in Gittin wants to know maybe that if that happened, and let's say there was a third brother, right, Levi. Okay, so this woman was married to Ruvain, was married to Shimon. Let's say Ruvain and Shimon both die. So Levi faces this woman on two levels, as the widow of Ruvain, as his sister-in-law from Ruvain, and as his sister-in-law from Shimon. So there's a Zika to one woman, but she's an Eshes Shnei HaMesim. So there's a big discussion there. Does it matter if Ruvain and Shimon died, one after the other? Or what, can it be that they died b'vasacha? So if you look at the Rajba,
it's also not in accordance with the pasuk. So how come Shem Achid, not the plural?
Yeah. So the assumption is that that if there is such a case, as it's not so clear. I mean, the Gemara in Gittin suggests this, that it's Shnei HaMesim, Eshes Shnei HaMesim. The Gemara in Yevamos actually, seems to say that all cases of Eshes Shnei HaMesim are only D'Rabbanan. They have like a simpler case. Let's say you have, let's say Ruvain marries Sarah, right? And then he dies, and then Shimon does what we call Maimer. Maimer means he's Makadesher with Kesef or a star, and then he dies. So now Levi faces Sarah, who originally was married to Ruvain, and then through Maimer was married to Shimon. But the Gemara says that's only Drabbanan. That's
only a Drabbanan.
Because Maimer is only Drabbanan according to Beis Hillel, who we paskin like. Beis Shammai thinks it might be Daraisa, but and therefore it's only Eshes Shnei HaMesim, D'Rabbanan. But the Gemara in Gittin considers that it might be Daraisa. And again, it's a very interesting case. But the Rajba in Gittin discusses your issue. What does it matter if they die at the same time, assuming Efshal Etzam same? How does that work out? There are such cases. It's not so far-fetched. You can almost find anything in the end if you have the ingenuity or the creativity or in some cases the time and the effort. But it is fascinating and inspiring how much this is just any Gemara, but how much mental energy and effort to really discern the principles is invested in these topics. They're not, as you can see, they're not easy themes. On the other hand, if you really, work on them, they're eminently accessible and understandable, and they're very logical. But they're where you draw the line, and and so on. These become like very interesting questions. Okay. Anyway, so to sum up, we did a section, I will call it, on Hutra and Dechuya, and it included both the formulations of this, as well as a whole bunch of implications and applications. Abba Shaul, Meuberes, multiple brothers and multiple wives. Now this Gemara about, the Gemara's Havamina, that even Bechaye Habal, if there are no children after a get, how do you explain the Gemara? Both what it thought and its maskana. Once we call Eshes Ach, the equivalent of Anida in this respect. And then we talked about Nesra and Hutra v'Nesra v'Chazer v'Hutra. And there are other, examples, as other issues that will come up, as well. But all of this revolves around maybe like the single most famous and consequential also, or at least as consequential as any other important question in Yibum, issue of how we square the Torah's prohibition of Eshes Ach on the one hand with the institution and the mitzvah of Yibum, on the other. And what really emerges, with some complexity for sure, is that the Rambam and the Ramban and the Ramah, the Rajba in many cases is on both sides, but mostly, as opposed to, Rashi, the Rashi and Nun Gimel, maybe I'll mention next time, and especially the Bali Tosas on Daf Gimel and Daf Ches and Daf Chaf, and on Yudamid Beis and Lamed Heyomid Beis and Nun Dalamid Beis. There's a certain, very interesting consistency in how they saw this problem, and it really impacts, so many different issues, and it's a different, institution if you look at it as Hutra or you look at it as Dechuya. Okay, so we'll stop here. And
just one brief question, Rabbi.
Sure.
But I'm going to say good night, Rabbi. Thank you.
In the Rabban on Sefer Mitzvot, he says something quite remarkable. He writes Mitzvot Yavum or Mitzvot Chalitza. He seems to equate both as being mitzvot. So the question is, whose mitzvah is it? Because in the Devarim 25, Pasuk Tet, it says that Chalitza is performed by the wife.
Right.
And so the question is it her mitzvah, Chalitza?
So,
and if so, which is the greater mitzvah, Yavum or Chalitza?
Well, it's clear that Yibum is the preferred mitzvah. That's clear from the Psukim in the Torah. On a practical level, that's the argument between Abba Shaul and the Chachamim that we've been speaking about, because if you can't do a perfect Yibum, it's probably better to do the second best Chalitza. In the beginning of the year, we discussed whether or not the woman is also obligated the man does the Yibum, you're quite right. The woman does the Chalitza. There are some views that the woman is also obligated to be a participant in the Yibum. But more people think, but more people think that that the man, even though he's not the active party in the Chalitza, but since he's the one who decides whether to do Yibum or Chalitza, effectively it's his decision that triggers the Chalitza. And therefore, maybe both of them are obligated, but he certainly is also obligated because it's his choice in the end. And again, he shouldn't defy her choice, but all things being equal, it's up to him, to make the choice, even though the Torah has a preferred choice. So the Ramban is really speaking about, what he calls a separate, obligation, a prohibition of lo yivneh, misha lo bana, shuv lo yivneh. And he's saying that applies, both, with respect to Yibum and Chalitza, because it's in the aftermath of one or the other. But you're quite right that there is a big discussion about, who these mitzvos devolve upon, the man or the woman, and whether you can distinguish between Yibum and Chalitza is part of the debate. For example, we talked about at the beginning of the year, do you make a bracha for Yibum? Do you make a bracha for Chalitza? And if so, who makes the bracha, he or she? So these are all very debated, topics.
Because
okay, great.
It's quite clear that the process of Chalitza is very derogatory towards the man.
Yeah, but it's still he triggers it through his choice not to do Yibum. But it is derogatory. That's the Rikika, the spitting, the statement that she makes.
And he's called by a derogatory name thereafter.
Yeah. Beitz Chalutzana. That's the no, there's no question that it is, that she, is formally, castigates him in some sense. And for not, for being derelict in his, preferable duty. And that's important. Yeah.
Thank you very much for clearing that up. Thank you.
Have a great evening, everybody. And we look forward to continuing next week. Probably a different topic.